Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. 10 for 10 for the week ending March 15, 2025. Our first story this week comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, which reports, or Risk and Compliance Journal and Richard Vandeford reporting, that the U.S. has targeted small currency transactions to fight cartels. The United States ordered money transmitters along the Mexican border to start filing reports on cash transactions greater than $200, a move that the Trump administration says will help in the fight against cartels. Money services, businesses, and group that includes currency transmitters, check cashing services, and other companies in 30 zip codes in the Texas and California border will need to file currency transaction reports with the government at a $200 threshold under what is known as a geographical targeting order, according to FinCEN. So the U.S. will finally start going after small dollar transactions. Next up from Reuters, in a case that, or a report that really shows the invidiousness of corruption and how it is a national security issue, something the Trump administration fails to understand, Singapore prosecutors say a U.S. server fraud case of over $390 million is linked to the possible transfer of NVIDIA artificial intelligence chips to DeepSeek. If you'll recall, in that part of the DeepSeek story, more chips were shipped to Singapore than the number of people live there by NVIDIA. Now, of course, Singapore is viewed as a low-risk country, but transshipment into China would seem to be quite easy and something that the United States has a lot of experience with around Iran and Iraq sanctions. Nevertheless, now we have potential corruption and fraud involved, and it shows the direct link between fraud, corruption, compliance, and national security. I wish the Trump administration would understand this on their cutbacks to the FCPA enforcement. Next up from the BBC, ever thought about protesting a Tesla? Ever thought about not buying a Tesla? Well, it turns out if you do so, you may be a domestic terrorist. As the president himself says, people protesting Tesla should be labeled as domestic terrorists. Yes. Now, the thought police are not here yet, but this is Donald Trump, so I'm sure that's something they are considering down the road. This has really gotten way afield, and Tesla is going to feel the pain for Elon Musk's actions. Next up from NBC News, the Justice Department says that the office that prosecutes public corruption will be slashed in size. The Trump administration is gutting the Justice Department unit that oversees prosecutions of public officials accused of corruption. Why on earth would they do that? The unit, the Public Integrity Section, has overseen some of the country's highest profile and most sensitive prosecutions. Now, though, only a small fraction of its employees will remain, and the unit will no longer directly handle investigations or prosecutions. If you don't handle investigations or prosecutions, one has to wonder, what's the purpose of having the unit? And I'm sure that's exactly where all of this is headed. The Trump administration seems to be saying, go ahead, engage in bribery and corruption, not just outside the United States, but inside the United States as well. So, sad day for the Public Integrity Section. And finally, from the Financial Times, we have a series of articles and just a very troubling court case where Jess Staley is trying to overturn his ban from the financial, or the FCA rather, and fine for his unhelpful reporting around his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And he's filed a court case for that. And what's come out so far is just, if not damning, it's certainly disgusting. And the article I picked for this episode is that he was so close to Epstein that his daughter called her Uncle Jeffrey. Well, if you're from the South, you know if you call a family friend uncle, that means they're immediately next to your next of kin in terms of how you think and feel about them. So the closeness of Staley to Epstein is just becoming more and more clear. Our next story comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal again, this time by Mingy Sun, which reports that despite the FCPA enforcement pause, ignoring anti-bribery laws still raises risks for companies. It's an excellent article from Mingy as she interviews some of the top FCPA experts across the country, including David Last, who worked as a chief at the FCPA unit during the Biden administration and is now a partner at Cleary Gottlieb. Also, Gary Coleman from the Transparency International U.S. And they both talked about how the FCPA makes the brand of Made in America stronger and more attractive, and that by pausing FCPA enforcement, the Trump administration is really denigrating that brand. Next up from ESPN, a national level chair umpire in the Dominican Republic was suspended for 6 years and fined $6,000 by the International Tennis Integrity Agency for manipulating scoring during matches to help someone who was placing bets. No word on whether he, and it's a he, placed bets, but this is corruption at the highest level in tennis. Next up from Reuters, Boeing must face shareholder class action following its MAX 9 blowout. This is the blowout that happened in Alaska with Alaska Airlines last year in January of 2024. And the shareholders are allowed to file a class action from that date forward against Boeing for Boeing's claims that they were operating not simply ethically and in compliance, but obviously safely as well. This apparently was not the case with the 737-9 MAX blowout, and the fallout from that still continues. I would note parenthetically there's been no resolution of the guilty plea, which was negotiated by the Department of Justice under the Biden administration against Boeing on a go-forward basis in the case in Texas. Next up from the New York Times, the lawyer appointed in the Eric Adams case to advise the court on whether it should allow the Trump administration to compel Mr. Adams' support in White House deportation efforts has come back and said that the court should dismiss the case, but it should be dismissed with prejudice. And this seems to me to be one of the more logical responses, that if you're going to dismiss this case, you can't hold over the head of someone charges so the government can get them to do what you do, essentially extorting actions from them. And the court will now make a final ruling on this. And finally, the district court in the Cognizant Technologies executives trial has told the government it's time to put up or shut up. The government asked for a 6-month extension to, quote, review the case, end quote, after having brought it to trial, reviewed it once under the Trump administration, and had asked for a 6-month delay. And now we're going to go to trial or not on or by April 7th. Have a great weekend, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. 10 for 10 is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network. I'd also urge you to check out the Daily Compliance News, which posts every week from Monday to Friday, where I give 4 curated stories of bribery, corruption, and compliance events that will allow you to help you start your day as well. So check out the Daily Compliance News and subscribe or rate and review to both 10 for 10 and the Daily Compliance News. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency. Finally, if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, I am preparing a new season of Adventures in Compliance where I go through the 4 novels of Sherlock Holmes. Hear it on the Compliance Podcast Network.